I went looking for aerial photographs of the Medina Ridge engagement, specifically the overhead imagery from February 27, 1991, showing the wreckage field. The Defense Intelligence Agency declassified thousands of Gulf War reconnaissance photos in 2006. Medina Ridge should be there. It's not. What I found instead were the debriefing transcripts, specifically the interviews with Iraqi Republican Guard tank crews conducted at holding facilities between March and May 1991. Someone at the Defense Intelligence Agency spent weeks interviewing survivors about what they experienced during the major armored engagements. The transcripts got declassified in 2013. Nobody talks about them. The interviews follow a standard format: name, unit, position, equipment type, date of engagement. Then the questions. What did you see? What did you hear? When did you know you were under attack? The answers repeat a specific phrase across dozens of separate interviews conducted by different interrogators in different locations. We saw nothing. Not saw little. Not saw unclear targets. Saw nothing. That's what made me stop looking for photographs, because the photographs would show destroyed T-72 tanks and BMP infantry fighting vehicles scattered across the desert in formations that suggest they never maneuvered. The imagery would be dramatic. But the transcripts explain something the photographs cannot. They explain why 550 Iraqi armored vehicles got destroyed in one night without returning effective fire. The crews were blind. The photograph I wanted, the one that doesn't exist in the public archive, supposedly showed the aftermath from 3,000 feet. Taken by an RF-4C Phantom reconnaissance aircraft on February 28th. The filing index references are dated. The image file is missing. Maybe it's still classified under some designation that outlasted the war. Maybe it got misfiled during the transition from physical archives to digital systems. Maybe someone decided the wreckage field was too graphic for public release even decades later. I've seen similar aerial shots from other Gulf War armored engagements. Highway of Death, M1A1 Ridge. Those images circulated widely. Medina Ridge didn't. That absence bothers me more than it should. What survived instead are the transcripts, page after page of Iraqi tank commanders and gunners describing the same experience. They heard explosions, felt impacts, saw their unit vehicles burning, but they never saw what was shooting at them. One transcript, I've got the document reference if anyone wants to verify, includes an exchange where the interrogator asks the same question 4 different ways, trying to confirm the answer. You saw muzzle flashes? No. You saw tracer rounds? No. You saw vehicle silhouettes? No. What did you see? Sand, smoke, our tanks exploding. The interrogator notes in the margin that the subject appeared frustrated by the repetition. Not evasive. Frustrated. Because, from the Iraqi perspective, they'd already answered the question. They saw nothing. That was the answer. That's the detail that made me abandon the photograph search and start researching thermal imaging technology instead. Because conventional wisdom says the Americans won Medina Ridge through superior training and better equipment. Both true, but incomplete. The Americans won because they could see and the Iraqis couldn't. Not saw better. Could see versus could not see. That's a different category of advantage. The transcripts are specific about timing. Most crews report knowing they were under attack only after adjacent vehicles started exploding. Reaction time between first impact in their unit and realizing they were the target ranged from 15 seconds to 2 minutes. Some crews never figured it out before their own vehicle got hit. February 26, 1991. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, Bradleys and Abrams tanks, roughly 4,500 soldiers, pushed east across the Iraqi desert ahead of 7th Corps' main assault. Their job was to find the Republican Guard divisions that had pulled back from Kuwait and were supposed to be forming a defensive line somewhere in the emptiness south of Basra. Around 15:30 hours, the weather collapsed. Not rain, sand. The wind picked up from the southwest, and by 1600, the visibility dropped to maybe 200 meters on a good stretch. Soldiers described it as orange fog. The sand wasn't falling, it was suspended, hanging in the air thick enough that breathing required covering your mouth. The temperature was dropping. It had been 23 degrees Celsius at noon. By 1630, it was 14 and falling. The combination of moisture and sand created this texture in the air that coated everything. Goggles became useless within minutes. You'd wipe them, and the sand would just smear across the lens, mixing with condensation. The second ACR kept moving. Standard doctrine said to halt in zero visibility conditions. But this wasn't zero visibility to them. The M1A1 Abrams tanks and M3 Bradley cavalry fighting vehicles had FLIR, forward-looking infrared. Thermal imaging. The storm that blinded every human eye in the Iraqi Republican Guard was basically transparent to their targeting systems. Around 1600 hours Ghost Troop, the lead element of 2nd Squadron, made contact. Their scouts reported vehicles ahead, lots of them, stationary. The Iraqis had stopped because of the weather. They were sitting in defensive positions, waiting for visibility to improve before continuing their withdrawal north. The Republican Guard units at Medina Ridge were equipped with T-72 tanks and BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles. Soviet-designed, decent equipment. The T-72 had a 125mm smoothbore gun that could kill an M1A1 from the front if the crew could land a shot on the lower glacis plate or turret ring. Effective range in clear conditions was maybe 2,000 meters for a well-trained crew. Their sights were optical. Some tanks had the TPDK-1 laser rangefinder sight, which was actually pretty good for 1980s technology. It gave accurate range data out to 4,000 meters. But it required the gunner to see the target first, visually, with his eyes or through an optical magnification system. In the sandstorm on February 26th, the Iraqi gunners could see maybe 150 meters on average. Some crews reported visibility as low as 50 meters. At that range, the engagement would have been close enough to identify individual crew hatches. It never got to that range. The Iraqi plan, according to captured tactical maps and commander testimony, was to use the storm as cover for their withdrawal. They'd displaced from their initial positions near Kuwait and were consolidating further north near Basra, where they could defend the approaches to Baghdad if coalition forces kept pushing. The storm gave them concealment from American air power, which had been devastating their formations during daylight movements. One Iraqi company commander told his interrogators they'd received orders to halt at 1545 and wait for visibility to improve before continuing north. They were told American ground forces were still 20 kilometers west and wouldn't advance in these conditions. Division intelligence assessed that NATO doctrine required visual contact for offensive operations. That assessment was correct for 1985. It was wrong for 1991. Thermal imaging works because everything above absolute zero emits infrared radiation. The hotter something is, the more radiation it emits. A T-72 tank engine, running at operating temperature, puts out a massive infrared signature. So does a human body at 37 degrees Celsius. So does anything warmer than the ambient environment. FLIR systems detect far infrared wavelengths, roughly 8 to 14 micrometers. That's the part of the spectrum where thermal contrast is strongest for the temperature differences you encounter in military operations. An idling diesel engine versus cold desert sand. A human against a concrete wall. A tank hull that's been sitting in the sun for 6 hours. Here's the tangent, because this is the part that matters. Visible light has wavelengths between 0.4 and 0.7 micrometers. Tiny. When you get a sandstorm, the suspended particles are typically 10 to 100 micrometers in diameter. They scatter visible light completely. That's why you can't see. The photons bounce off the sand particles in random directions before reaching your eye, total diffusion. But far infrared wavelengths are longer, 8 to 14 micrometers. Sand particles that completely block visible light are essentially transparent to thermal radiation in this range. Some scattering occurs. The thermal image gets slightly degraded. You lose some resolution. But the heat signature passes through. The AN/VSG-2 tank. Thermal sight mounted on the M1A1. Abrams could detect a tank-sized heat source at 3,000 meters through clear air. In the Medina Ridge sandstorm, effective detection range dropped to maybe 2,500 meters, still longer than Iraqi optical sights could see in perfect weather. The system worked by scanning the field of view with a detector that measured infrared radiation intensity. It built an image where hotter objects appeared brighter. The display showed thermal contrast in real time. A running tank engine looked like a white-hot blob on a gray background. Even a tank that had shut down its engine still retained enough residual heat to show up for 20 or 30 minutes, depending on conditions. The Iraqi tanks at Medina Ridge were running their engines. They needed electrical power for radios and turret traverse, and they were planning to move once visibility improved. Every single vehicle was radiating a perfect thermal signature into an environment where American gunners could see them clearly and Iraqi gunners could see nothing. The M1A1's main gun, the M2 5.6 120mm smoothbore, fired the M829 A1 armor-piercing sabot round at 1,575 meters per second. Depleted uranium penetrator. It could punch through a T-72's frontal armor at any range. The thermal sight could detect the target. Standard engagement procedure was 2 rounds per target. First round to kill. Second round to confirm. Fire rate was about 8 seconds between shots for a good crew. The physics were stupid simple. One side could see through the storm. The other side was blind. That's not a tactical advantage. That's not even a technological edge. That's a different category of warfare where the fundamental assumptions about combat don't apply anymore. The Soviets had thermal sights too, the TPN 349 series. But they were rare. Reserved for battalion commanders and specialized reconnaissance vehicles. The average T-72 commander in an Iraqi Republican Guard armored division had optical sights that couldn't penetrate the sandstorm. He sat inside a steel box broadcasting his position to an enemy he couldn't see. The Republican Guard at Medina Ridge probably had a dozen tanks in the entire brigade with any thermal capability. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment had thermal sights on every single combat vehicle. Captain H.R. McMaster commanded Eagle Troop of the 2nd Squadron. The after-action report from his unit describes the opening engagement sequence. At 16:18 hours, his lead scout section reported thermal contacts at 2,400 meters. Multiple vehicles. Stationary. Hull-down positions behind berms. McMaster's gunner acquired the first target at 16:21. T-72 Satut tank. The thermal image showed the engine compartment as bright white against the gray-brown background of cold sand. The gunner laid the crosshairs on center mass and fired. The M829 A1 sabot round crossed 2,400 meters in under 2 seconds. Hit. The thermal signature flared. That's ammunition cooking off inside the turret. The temperature spike bloomed white on the display, then faded to irregular hot spots as burning fuel and propellant settled. 8 seconds later, the gunner engaged the next target, another T-72. Same result. The Iraqi tanks weren't moving. They weren't returning fire. According to McMaster's report, some vehicles started their engines and attempted to maneuver after the shooting started, but most just sat there. The crews either didn't know where the fire was coming from or couldn't see far enough through the storm to acquire targets. Eagle Troop destroyed 28 Iraqi armored vehicles in 23 minutes. That's from McMaster's official count verified by ground reconnaissance afterward. The actual number might be higher because some vehicles were already burning when Eagle Troop moved through the position, and unit attribution gets messy. One engagement stood out in the declassified reports. An Iraqi T-72 commander opened his hatch during the firing. You could see it on thermal. The hatch opened and a heat signature, a human body, emerged partway. Then the vehicle exploded. The after-action analysis speculated the commander was trying to visually acquire targets because his gunner couldn't find anything through the sights. Ghost Troop to Eagles North reported similar results. They engaged 37 vehicles between 16:05 and 16:40 hours. Their gunnery officer noted in the log that several Iraqi tanks fired their main guns during the engagement, but the rounds went into empty desert. not suppressive fire, not ranging shots, random aiming. The Iraqi gunners were shooting at nothing, hoping to hit something. The Iron Troop engagement log, I've seen excerpts, not the full document, describes one T-72 that managed to traverse its turret toward the American position. The gunner acquired it mid-traverse. Fired. The sabot round hit the turret as it was still rotating. The Iraqi crew never completed the turn. By 1800 hours, 2nd Squadron had pushed through the initial Iraqi positions and was consolidating on the far side. They'd encountered elements of the Tawakalna Division, Republican Guard, supposed to be Iraq's best units. The Americans reported one M3, badly damaged by what was probably friendly fire during the confusion. No confirmed enemy kills of American vehicles. The Iraqi return fire that did occur was unguided. Crews fired in the general direction they thought threats were coming from based on sound or the backblast signatures of previous American shots. None of it was aimed fire in the doctrinal sense. It was desperation. The shooting continued after dark. Thermal sights don't care about daylight. The engagements actually got easier once the sun set because the ambient temperature dropped and thermal contrast improved. A warm tank engine against cold night air shows up even clearer than during the day. The interrogation transcripts from Republican Guard tankers captured at Medina Ridge follow similar patterns. The interrogators were looking for tactical intelligence, unit dispositions, command structure, morale assessments. What they documented instead was sensory deprivation. Staff Sergeant Ali Hassan, T-72 gunner, Tawakalna Division. Captured February 27th. His transcript runs 4 pages. He describes sitting in the gunner's position watching his unit get destroyed around him. He never saw an American vehicle. He saw explosions, felt the concussion through the hull when rounds hit nearby tanks, heard the impacts over the intercom chatter. His tank commander ordered him to scan for targets. He scanned, saw sand. The TPDK-1 sight magnification was useless because magnifying nothing just gives you bigger nothing. He asked his commander what to shoot at. The commander didn't know. They waited. 2 vehicles in their platoon exploded within 30 seconds of each other. Still, no targets visible. Hassan's tank took a hit at 16:34 hours, according to American logs. The sabot round penetrated the right side of the turret and exited through the left, killed the commander instantly. The impact threw Hassan against the sight housing. He doesn't remember exiting the vehicle, but he was found 50 meters away with a broken collarbone and thermal burns on his hands. Lieutenant Khalid Abd al-Wahhab commanded a company of T-72s. He survived because his tank wouldn't start that morning, and he was riding in a BMP command vehicle instead. His transcript is longer, 9 pages, more detailed. He had tactical situational awareness his crews didn't. Abd al-Wahhab describes receiving reports from his platoon leaders that they were under attack but couldn't locate the enemy. He ordered them to return fire. They asked where to shoot. He told them to shoot at the muzzle flashes. They reported seeing no muzzle flashes. He thought they were panicking. The transcripts note he became agitated during this part of the interview when he realized the interrogators believed his crews were telling the truth. 7 of his 14 tanks were destroyed before he ordered the survivors to withdraw. They retreated north through the storm. American units didn't pursue immediately. They were consolidating their positions and accounting for ammunition expenditure. Abd al-Wahhab's remaining vehicles made it 3 kilometers before running into another American element and losing 4 more tanks. One gunner, name redacted in the declassified version, told interrogators he fired 6 main gun rounds during the engagement. He aimed at heat shimmers in the sand that he thought might be engine exhaust. All misses. He knew they were misses because nothing exploded and his tank kept getting shot at. He asked his commander if they should run. The commander said running would make them easier targets. They stayed in position. Their tank burned 40 seconds later. The transcripts include details the interrogators probably didn't think were significant. Multiple crews mention the sound, not the sound of explosions. The sound before the explosions. A crack. Some describe it as a whip crack. Others say it sounded like sheet metal tearing. That's the supersonic sabot round passing through air before impact, traveling faster than sound. By the time you hear it, the round has already hit something, One crew heard that sound, and their tank exploded in the same instant. Another crew heard it twice before the third round killed their vehicle. The sound became associated with death. Random. Unavoidable. Coming from nowhere. The Battle of Medina Ridge lasted roughly 9 hours, if you count from first contact at 15:30 hours, February 26th, through final disengagement around 0:30 hours, February 27th. The 7th Corps After-Action Assessment compiled in March 1991 lists the results. Iraqi losses: 186 T-72 tanks destroyed, 127 other armored vehicles destroyed, mostly BMP infantry fighting vehicles and BRDM reconnaissance vehicles, 245 trucks and support vehicles destroyed or captured. American intelligence later revised the total upward to 550-plus vehicles after aerial reconnaissance and ground surveys identified additional wrecks scattered across a wider area than initial reports covered. American losses: 1 M2, Bradley damaged by what was likely a 25mm round from another Bradley during a night engagement, where two units converged on the same objective from different angles. The vehicle was repaired and returned to service within 48 hours. 0 M1A1 tanks lost. 0 killed in action. That's not a battle. That's target practice, with moving paper silhouettes that don't shoot back effectively. The disparity shows up in the ammunition expenditure logs. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment fired approximately 9,000 rounds of 25mm cannon ammunition. That's Bradley autocannon fire against trucks and infantry positions. They fired 900 rounds of 120mm tank ammunition, roughly 2 rounds per armored kill. Textbook gunnery. Iraqi ammunition expenditure is harder to calculate because the surviving vehicles withdrew and nobody counted their remaining rounds. But based on impacts observed during the battle and unexploded ordnance cleared afterward, the Iraqis fired maybe 200 main gun rounds total. Most missed by hundreds of meters. Some didn't even land in areas where American forces were operating. They were shooting blind and hoping. The kill ratio gets worse when you factor in time. Some American gunners engaged and destroyed multiple targets in under 2 minutes. One Abrams crew, their names are in the classified portion of the report, killed 7 T-72s in 11 minutes. That's 95 seconds per kill, including target acquisition, engagement, and moving to the next firing position. The weather stayed bad through the night. Visibility for human eyes never improved beyond 300 meters. The thermal advantage held constant. Every engagement followed the same pattern. Americans detected Iraqi vehicles at range, engaged, destroyed, moved to next target. The Iraqis never adapted because there was no adaptation possible. You can't fight what you can't see. Other units joined the battle as 7th Corps pushed through the Republican Guard defensive line. The 1st Infantry Division attacked Objective Norfolk to the south. Same results. The 3rd Armored Division hit Objective Dorset to the north. Same results. Across the entire front, Iraqi armored units got systematically destroyed by an enemy they could not engage. Soviet observers attached to Iraqi headquarters started filing reports back to Moscow during the battle. I don't have access to those reports. They're Russian military archives, and if they've been declassified, I haven't found the English translations. But we know they were filing because of what happened afterward. The Soviet Army started a crash program to equip their tanks with thermal sights. Not some tanks, all tanks. They recognized that optical sights were obsolete. Thermal imaging wasn't a nice-to-have anymore. It was survival. The engagement at Medina Ridge convinced Soviet planners that their doctrine for armored warfare was dead. They'd built tactics around visual engagement ranges and mutual support between vehicles that could see each other. The Americans had demonstrated that none of that mattered if one side could see and the other couldn't. The Soviet 4th Directorate, responsible for analyzing foreign military operations, produced a classified assessment of Medina Ridge sometime in March 1991. I've never seen the full document. What exists in Western archives are excerpts that appeared in a 1997 RAND Corporation study on post-Cold War Russian military reform. The excerpts are translations of translations, so the phrasing might be imprecise, but the conclusions are clear. The Soviets calculated that American M1A1 crews achieved first-round hit probabilities above 90% at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters during the Gulf War armored engagements. Soviet doctrine assumed first-round hit rates of 60 to 70% at 1,800 meters under ideal conditions with well-trained crews. The Americans were hitting more reliably at longer ranges in terrible visibility. The assessment identified thermal imaging as the critical capability gap. Soviet analysts had known about Western thermal technology for years. They'd developed their own systems, but they'd treated thermal sights as specialized equipment for reconnaissance and command vehicles. The Americans had fielded thermal capability across their entire armored force. Every tank, every fighting vehicle. That's a different order of magnitude. One paragraph from the RAND translation stands out. The engagement at Medina Ridge demonstrated that conventional armored tactics based on visual acquisition and mutual supporting fire are obsolete when facing an opponent with comprehensive thermal imaging capability. Iraqi units equipped with optically aimed weapon systems were reduced to static targets awaiting destruction. Static targets awaiting destruction. That's Soviet military analysis. They don't use emotional language in tactical assessments. That phrasing is as close as the Red Army gets to saying the Iraqis never had a chance. The 4th Directorate calculated that Soviet tank divisions facing NATO forces in a European conflict would experience similar results. Their T-80 and T-72 tanks had better armor than Iraqi export models, better training, better doctrine. None of it mattered if NATO could see through weather and darkness, and the Soviets couldn't. The recommended solution was immediate deployment of the Buran-Catherine thermal sight across all frontline tank units. But the Catherine system was French-designed. The Soviets had purchased sample units and reverse-engineered them, but production was limited and expensive. Full fleet retrofit would take years and enormous funding. The Soviet military budget was already collapsing as the USSR disintegrated. By December 1991, the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. The thermal sight retrofit program got inherited by the Russian Federation, which had even less money. They prioritized a handful of elite units. Everyone else kept using optical sights through the 1990s. The Americans knew the Soviets were studying Medina Ridge. DIA collected intelligence on Soviet reaction to Gulf War results. One cable from April 1991 noted that Soviet military journals were publishing unusually detailed analyses of American thermal imaging systems. The cable assessed that Soviet confidence in their ability to compete with NATO armored forces had been fundamentally damaged. The assessment was correct. Russian military theorists started writing about the reconnaissance strike complex, the idea that future warfare would be decided by who could detect and engage targets first at extended ranges. Thermal imaging was the foundation. Without it, you were fighting blind. Iraqi crews at Medina Ridge learned that lesson in the worst possible way. They sat in their tanks watching their unit disappear around them. Explosions everywhere. No targets, no way to fight back. Just waiting for the impact that would kill them. The Soviets learned it from reading the reports and running the numbers. They concluded their entire armored force was obsolete. Then they ran out of money to fix it. Captain Majid Karim survived Medina Ridge. He commanded a tank platoon in the Tawakkalna division. His interrogation took place at a holding facility near Safwan on March 15, 1991. The transcript is 11 pages. Most of it covers standard intelligence questions about unit structure and equipment status. The last 2 pages are different. The interrogator asked Karim what he would tell other Iraqi tank officers about fighting American armored forces. Karim said he wouldn't tell them anything because there was nothing to tell. The interrogator pressed, asked if there were tactical lessons, ways to improve performance. Karim's answer appears in the transcript exactly as translated. You cannot fight what you cannot see. We could not see. That is all. 17 of the 43 tanks in Karim's battalion were destroyed at Medina Ridge. He doesn't know how many crew members died because the survivors scattered during the withdrawal and he never saw most of them again. His own tank survived because it was positioned behind a rise that blocked the American line of fire until after his unit had already started retreating. He considers this luck, nothing else. Another survivor, Lieutenant Haider al-Shamari, told interrogators he would never crew a tank again. He'd been a gunner, professional soldier, 8-year service. He described sitting at his site watching nothing while his friends burned. The transcript notes he refused to discuss specific engagement details. Just repeated that he saw nothing and his crew saw nothing, and nobody in his company saw anything except their own vehicles exploding. Al-Shamari requested transfer to infantry after repatriation. The request was granted. He served in an Iraqi Army motorized rifle unit through the late 1990s. I found a reference to his name in a 2003 U.S. military database of former Iraqi officers interviewed during the Second Gulf War. He was working as a truck driver in Basra. He told the interviewer he'd driven trucks since 1992 and had no interest in discussing his tanker service. Some crews never made it to interrogation. They died in their vehicles or during the retreat. The exact casualty count for Medina Ridge is disputed. American estimates range from 400 to 600 Iraqi killed. Iraqi sources from the 1990s don't provide specific numbers, just lists of units that were reorganized or reconstituted after February 1991, which is military bureaucracy language for destroyed. The Republican Guard formations that fought at Medina Ridge were rebuilt over the following years. New equipment, new personnel. But the institutional memory persisted. Iraqi tank crews who served in the late 1990s were taught that American thermal sights made conventional armored combat impossible. Some training manuals from that period, captured in 2003, included sections on fighting at night and in poor visibility that basically said, "Don't." One passage from a 1998 Iraqi Armored Warfare Manual. Enemy thermal imaging systems provide targeting capability in all weather and lighting conditions. Engagement ranges exceed our optical sight capability. Avoid direct confrontation with American armored forces. That's doctrine written by an army that learned they were obsolete. They kept training tank crews and